In this movie, we're going to talk about the blur and sharpen controls available to us here in DaVinci Resolve, and it sometimes seems a little counterintuitive that we would even have these controls in a color correction app, right? Why would we bother? And the answer is, oftentimes our clients don't really know how soft or sharp their images are until they come into the color correction suite. They're looking at our high quality external reference monitor. We expand out the contrast like we talk about in the primaries chapter, and then all of a sudden all this detail pops out, and then sometimes not enough detail pops out. Sometimes I look and say, oh, I was a little soft on that shot. I had no idea. I didn't see that it was soft because the image didn't have a lot of contrast. And at that point, the client says, can you help me a little bit to sharpen up this image? And the answer is, yeah, actually we can. And we're in the right environment to do sharpening and blurring. And to make that happen here in Resolve, let's come on down to this icon here, which is our Blur, Sharpen, and Mist palette. And we've got essentially 3 sets of controls and then 3 sets of sub-controls. If I come to this pull down, I've got blur controls, sharpen controls, and mist controls. Blur and sharpen seem pretty obvious. They do what they say. Mist is a kind of pro-mist look, which is the classic Vaseline thing where we keep the high frequency detail like eyes and lips and blur out some of the low frequency detail like skin. That's typically how Pro Mist has been used professionally, and this is a tool that allows us to mimic that kind of look. But to understand how to do Mist, we first have to talk about Blur and Sharpen. Let's jump into Blur. We've got RGB controls for radius and HV ratio, that's horizontal and vertical ratio. And if I come in here and click Reset, everything's set in its default state. For HV ratio and radius, that's 0.5 are their default states, meaning they're doing nothing. They're having no effect on the image. It's not until we start moving these up or down that we start getting an effect on the image. I'm going to Option S into a new node, and then Option F so we get a better look at our image. And let's start with the radius, and this is blur radius and sharpen radius. The more I move it up, the more the image blurs. If I reset to default and drop down, now I'm going into sharpening, and the more I drop it down, the more the image sharpens. The most amount of sharpening I can do brings us down to 0. Blurring's a little different. Blurring, I can come up to the top here and it's set at 1, and I can just keep clicking and dragging in one smooth motion, and now we're up here to about 543 is the highest I can do on this screen when I'm in this mode for screencasting, but the actual highest number is 6. And notice when I click on one slider, I'm moving all 3 sliders, red, green, and blue. That's because they're linked together using this icon here. I'll click on it, and now I've got red, green, and blue can be blurred independently of each other. Very useful if maybe you want to blur out a color channel. So blue is often the noisiest of the color channels. So maybe you just want to blur out the blue color channel a little bit just to get rid of some of that noise. Very useful in that situation. Let's relink. Let's kick up the blur all the way. And now let's go to HV ratio, and that's horizontal and vertical direction. Set at 0.5, we're blurring horizontally and vertically just the same. I'll click one of these sliders and drag up, and now we're going horizontally. I'll go in the other direction, and now we're going vertically. And these are the maximum settings. There is nothing above 1 and nothing below 0. I can unlink these 3 channels and work them individually. Once you know these 2 tools, you pretty much know about half the interface you need to know for all 3 of these, because any setting I set in blur and HV ratio carries over to all 3 of these settings. I go into sharpen, these stay the same. Let's kick this up. I go into mist, these stay the same. I go into blur, these stay the same. All that changes is in sharpening, I get a new set of tools that open up, scaling and the core softness and level. And to really understand what's going on here, first thing you need to know is this scaling tool only works when you're sharpening. That's why it pops up here. If I do something now, we're blurring, we're not sharpening. It's not having any effect no matter what I do. Let me reset. And let's switch this to a sharpening operation. So I'm going to come down here. I'll do some excessive sharpening on this image. And I'll Command D before and then after, so you can see all that sharpening we're doing. So now we're in sharpening mode. Scaling opens up. What does it do? Well, at 0.25, it's default, doing nothing. If I click and drag down, if I get it down to 0, there is no sharpening going on. If I Command D, that's the node turned off. I Command D again, that's the node turned on. There's no difference. This will turn off all your sharpening operations. If I reset to default, go the other way, guess what happens? It amplifies the sharpening operation until I get it all the way up to 1, which is the maximum amount of amplification of our sharpening. And now if I were to switch into blur, notice scaling, I don't have access to it here, but it is still having an effect on this operation. So it just doesn't give you access to that tool. So if I'm using this tool, I'll stay in sharpen. It doesn't change any of the algorithms. What it does is it gives you the opportunity, if you're sharpening, to amplify or kind of relax, lessen the effect of the sharpen operation. Now this brings us to core softness and level. These are tough kind of tools to understand how to use, frankly, and I don't know how many years I've been using DaVinci Resolve, and I can tell you I've come to this about twice, but it's useful to understand the concept. What it does is allow you to better isolate your sharpening controls to the detail in the image. So if I didn't want sharpening happening here in her shirt, what I could do is kick up the level control to exclude areas of lesser detail and only include areas of high detail, high contrast, that will be affected by the sharpening operation. So if I Command D now, I'm leaving her shirt alone, I'm leaving the skin tones alone, and I'm only working on those high frequency edges. Coring softness allows you to kind of fine tune what DaVinci Resolve considers to be an area of low detail or high detail. So by lifting this up, I'm again starting to include those areas I just excluded. Let's say I wanted some sharpening in her shirt, but not a lot. Well, I could lift this up a little bit, and that might be most useful maybe on skin tones. And let's talk about skin tones, because now that we understand coring softness and levels, it's starting to look like this might be a really useful feature for skin tones. And there's a special mode in here that really is kind of optimized for skin tone and beauty operations, which is mist. Now the mist control kind of takes everything we've already learned up to this point, but it takes a little bit of explaining to do to completely understand what's going on. So let's take a look at that coming up.